Howdy, partners, and welcome to tonight's tale from the untamed frontiers of the American West. As the evening sun sets over distant mountains, we invite you to lay down your weary head and drift into the mysterious world of Red Dead Redemption. Each night, we'll share different tales from these wild lands, where outlaws and legends still roam free. And when our story ends, the gentle sounds of the frontier, crackling campfires, distant coyotes, rustling prairie grass, and the soft whisper of the wind will carry you into peaceful dreams beneath the star-filled western sky, with no advertisements to disturb your slumber. Now, saddle up, partner, and let's mosey on down to tonight's tale. The amber light of late afternoon filtered through the dusty windows of Sheriff Thomas Wade's office, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. At 61, Thomas had seen enough frontier justice to know that some promises echoed longer than the men who made them. The weight of his badge had grown heavier with each passing season, not from the metal itself, but from the accumulation of choices that followed a lawman through quiet moments when duty gave way to memory. Outside, the town of Clearwater dozed through another sweltering August day, its handful of permanent residents seeking shade wherever they could find it. The town had been dying a slow death since the railroad chose a route 30 miles north, taking with it the promise of prosperity that had drawn dreamers and drifters to this particular patch of desert 20 years earlier. The letter on his desk bore the official seal of the territorial government, informing him that his replacement would arrive within the month. Retirement, they called it, though Thomas recognized it as forced obsolescence. He should have felt relief, but instead found himself contemplating unfinished business that had nothing to do with official duties, and everything to do with a promise made to a dying friend 15 years earlier. Elias Crow had been the finest horseman Thomas ever knew, a man who could read animal and terrain with equal skill. When Elias spoke of his final ride, Thomas had listened with the attention reserved for words that carried unusual weight. Thomas had offered to accompany him, but Elias declined with characteristic independence. "This is something I need to do alone, Thomas, but if something happens to me out there, don't let them bury me in town. Take me up to the mesa, to the old cottonwood grove near Willow Creek." The promise had seemed simple enough at the time, but when Elias failed to return and search parties found no trace beyond hoofprints that vanished in the desert wind, Thomas discovered that some promises became heavier in their breaking than their making. For 15 years he had told himself that circumstances beyond his control had made fulfillment impossible. But on certain windless nights, Thomas found himself staring toward the mesa, where some residents claimed they still saw a solitary rider moving slowly across the starlit landscape. A knock at his office door interrupted these contemplations, followed by the entrance of Jake Morrison, the town's stable hand, and one of the few residents who had known Elias well. At 73, Jake moved with careful deliberation, his weathered face bearing the permanent squint of someone who had spent a lifetime reading the horizon. "Sheriff," Jake said, settling into the chair across from Thomas's desk. "Figured you might want to know. Elias's horse is acting strange again." Thomas looked up immediately. The old stable hand had been caring for Thunder, Elias's magnificent black stallion, since the horseman's disappearance. The animal had been found 3 days after Elias vanished, standing riderless near the town's outskirts. Just like before when folks claimed to see the rider on the mesa, Thunder gets restless around sunset, pacing his stall and whinnying toward the desert. Last night he damn near kicked his way out. Thomas had heard similar reports before, always coinciding with alleged sightings of the ghostly horseman. Anyone else mention seeing anything unusual recently? Young Danny Parker was out checking his traps yesterday evening, Jake replied. Claims he saw dust clouds moving across the northern section of the mesa around midnight, moving too steady for wild horses. Said it looked like just one horse and rider. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. Danny Parker was reliable, not given to flights of imagination. Thunder still reacts when you mention Elias's name, Jake continued. Animals know things we don't, Sheriff. The conviction in Jake's voice reflected more than casual observation or wishful thinking. The old stable hand had witnessed the bond between horse and rider that transcended ordinary partnership, becoming something closer to mutual understanding between kindred spirits who had found their perfect complement in each other. If Thunder continued responding to his missing master's name after 15 years, perhaps it indicated awareness of presence rather than mere memory. I've been thinking, Thomas said finally, making decision that had been building through months of contemplation. Maybe it's time I took one more ride out to the mesa before I leave Clearwater for good. See if I can find some trace of what happened to Elias, or at least satisfy myself that I've done everything possible to honor his request. Jake's weathered face showed understanding mixed with concern. That's dangerous country, Sheriff. Especially for a man riding alone. Easy to get lost out there, even for someone who knows the territory. Thomas appreciated the warning while recognizing its deeper implications. Jake wasn't simply concerned about physical dangers, getting lost, thrown from a horse, or caught in sudden weather changes that could prove fatal in desert country. He was acknowledging the possibility that some searches led to encounters with mysteries that challenged conventional understanding of what was possible, and that Thomas might discover more than he expected or wanted on the mesa where Elias Crow had vanished. I won't be riding alone, Thomas replied, decision crystallizing as he spoke. Danny Parker knows that territory well from his hunting expeditions, and he's young enough to handle whatever we might encounter out there. If he's willing to come along, we'll make it a proper search, methodical and thorough. Jake nodded approval of this plan, recognizing wisdom in partnership over solitary expedition. Boy's got good sense and steady nerves, he agreed. If anyone can help you find what you're looking for, it'd be Danny. Evening approached with characteristic desert swiftness, heat dissipating rapidly once the sun disappeared behind western mountains. Thomas walked slowly through Clearwater's main street, noting how quickly the town transitioned from oppressive afternoon lethargy to cautious evening activity. Thomas found Danny Parker at his family's modest house on Clearwater's eastern edge, where the young man was cleaning small game trapped during his recent expedition. Danny looked up as Thomas approached, immediately recognizing official visit. "Evening, Sheriff," Danny said, setting aside the rabbit he had been preparing. "Something I can help you with?" "I'm planning a search expedition to the mesa," Thomas explained directly. "Looking for any trace of what happened to Elias Crow 15 years ago. I need someone who knows the territory, interested in earning some extra money for a few days' work." Danny's expression showed immediate interest, tempered by caution. "That's rough country, Sheriff. There's stories about strange things happening out there at night." "What kind of stories?" Thomas asked. Danny glanced around, then lowered his voice. "Riders who don't cast shadows. Hoof prints that disappear while you're looking at them. Most folks dismiss it as desert tricks, but I've spent enough time out there to know the difference." "I'm not looking for ghost stories," Thomas clarified. "I'm looking for answers about what happened to a friend. If we encounter anything unusual, we'll deal with it sensibly, but I need someone who won't panic if things get strange." "When do you want to leave?" Danny asked, after considering the proposition. "Tomorrow at dawn. We'll take supplies for 3 days. Jake Morrison will prepare horses and equipment." "I'll be ready," Danny agreed, offering his hand. My family could use the extra money, and I'd like to know the truth about what happened out there myself. As Thomas walked back toward his house, satisfaction with the day's decisions mixed with apprehension about what tomorrow might reveal. Standing on his porch, he gazed toward the mesa that rose dark against star-filled sky, wondering if somewhere among those elevated ridges the spirit of Elias Crow continued searching for something beyond reach. A movement caught his eye, distant and indistinct, but suggestive of horse and rider moving slowly across elevated terrain. Thomas watched intently, trying to distinguish reality from wishful thinking. For several minutes the movement continued, too steady for wild animals, too isolated for ordinary travelers. Then it vanished, leaving Thomas uncertain whether he had witnessed genuine phenomenon or manufactured sighting from desire to believe. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of dusty trails and conversations with men who spoke from memory rather than presence. When dawn arrived, Thomas rose feeling determined, ready to begin what might prove his final investigation as Clearwater's sheriff. Jake Morrison had prepared their horses and supplies with characteristic thoroughness, selecting sturdy mounts capable of handling rough terrain while carrying sufficient food, water, and equipment for extended expedition into country where assistance remained far away. Thunder watched their preparations with unusual interest, the aging stallion's attention focused toward the mesa as if recognizing connection between their departure and his absent master. "Helmet knows," Jake observed, noticing Thomas watching the horse's behavior. "Animals sense these things before we do. Thunder's been restless all night, more agitated than I've seen him in years." Danny arrived precisely at sunrise, equipped for several days in challenging terrain with pragmatic selection of gear that demonstrated his experience with extended hunting expeditions. His manner suggested nervous excitement balanced by appropriate respect for the dangers they might encounter, both conventional and otherwise. "Ready when you are, Sheriff," he said, checking his rifle and ensuring his water containers were secure. "I've been thinking about the best route to take. There's several ways up onto the mesa, but only a couple that won't exhaust the horses before we really get started searching." Thomas nodded approval of this planning, recognizing valuable preparation that would conserve their energy for actual investigation, rather than wasteful navigation of difficult terrain. "You know the country better than I do," he acknowledged. "I'll follow your lead on routes and water sources." As they prepared to depart, several Clearwater residents gathered to observe their expedition, offering various expressions of concern, curiosity, and advice. The attention made Thomas uncomfortable. He preferred conducting investigations without public scrutiny that might influence his objectivity or create pressure for dramatic results to justify community interest. "Be careful out there," called Mrs. Henderson from the general store. "That mesa's claimed enough good men already." Other voices offered similar warnings, mixed with expressions of hope that they might finally solve the mystery of Elias Crow's disappearance. Thomas acknowledged these comments with polite nods, while privately hoping their expedition would attract less attention than their departure suggested it already had. They rode out of Clearwater as morning light began revealing detail in landscape that had been reduced to silhouettes during pre-dawn preparation. The familiar streets and buildings quickly gave way to open desert, where scattered homesteads and small ranches marked the transition between settled territory and genuine wilderness. Beyond this buffer zone lay the mesa country where Elias had vanished. Elevated terrain of broken ridges, hidden valleys, and ancient watercourses that could conceal or confuse even experienced travelers. Danny led them along a well-established trail that followed natural contours while maintaining steady progress toward their destination. His route selection demonstrated intimate knowledge of the terrain gained through years of hunting expeditions, avoiding obstacles that would slow their progress while ensuring access to water sources necessary for extended travel in arid country. Ilias used to come through here regularly, Danny observed, as they passed distinctive rock formation that served as landmark. My pa always said he could track anything through country like this. Man or animal, it didn't matter. Never met anyone who could read sign the way he could. Thomas remembered Elias's remarkable tracking abilities, skills that had proven valuable during numerous joint investigations where conventional law enforcement techniques proved insufficient for frontier conditions. The irony that such an accomplished tracker had vanished without leaving definitive trail remained one of the most puzzling aspects of his disappearance. "Did you ever encounter him during your hunting trips?" Thomas asked, gathering information that might prove relevant to their search. "Few times," Danny replied, always polite, always respectful of other folks' activities. He'd share information about water sources or animal movements, but he was private about his own business. Last time I saw him was maybe 6 months before he disappeared. Seemed different somehow, more focused on something specific. This observation aligned with Tomas's memory of Ilias's behavior during their final conversations, when the horseman had mentioned unfinished business on the mesa that required personal attention. Whatever had drawn Elias to his final ride had been building over an extended period, suggesting planned expedition rather than impulsive decision. The morning progressed steadily as they climbed gradually toward mesa elevation, desert terrain transforming subtly around them as they gained altitude. Sparse vegetation gave way to different plant communities adapted to elevated conditions, while rocky outcroppings became more frequent and dramatic. Wildlife sign increased, tracks and droppings indicating presence of deer, javelinas, and various smaller animals that found shelter and forage in the mesa's protected valleys. By midday, they had reached elevation, where broader vistas revealed landscape extending toward distant horizons in all directions. Behind them, Clearwater appeared, a tiny collection of buildings overwhelmed by surrounding emptiness, while ahead the mesa stretched across elevated terrain that could conceal countless secrets among its labyrinth of ridges and hidden valleys. "This is where the real search begins," Danny announced, dismounting to rest the horses and consult mental map of terrain features he had encountered during previous expeditions. Elias's trail was last reported heading northeast from here toward Willow Creek country, but that was 15 years ago, and weather can erase sign completely in that amount of time. Thomas studied the terrain ahead, noting numerous possibilities for routes that might have attracted Elias's attention during his final ride. The mesa offered hundreds of potential destinations: hidden valleys, secluded water sources, elevated vantage points that provided strategic observation of surrounding country. Without more specific information about Elias's intended destination, their search would require systematic investigation of numerous possibilities. "We'll start with Willow Creek," Doms decided. "Elias mentioned the cottonwood grove there during our last conversation. Even if that wasn't his specific destination, it might provide clues about his general intentions." They resumed travel, following Danny's navigation through increasingly complex terrain, where established trails gave way to game paths and eventually to route finding that required constant assessment of obstacles and opportunities. The work demanded attention that left little opportunity for conversation. Each rider focused on managing his horse through challenging terrain while maintaining general direction toward their objective. Late afternoon found them approaching Willow Creek drainage, where seasonal watercourse created verdant corridor through otherwise arid landscape. Cottonwood trees, their leaves already showing autumn's influence despite August heat, provided welcome shade after hours of exposure to intense desert sun. The sound of moving water, Even the modest flow characteristic of late summer offered psychological relief as much as practical resource for themselves and their horses. "This is it," Danny announced, dismounting near a grove of mature cottonwoods that Elias had specifically mentioned to Thomas years earlier. If he came here for some particular reason, this would be the logical place to start looking for signs. Thomas surveyed the grove carefully, noting features that might have attracted Elias's attention or provided clues about his final intentions. The cottonwoods had grown considerably during the 15 years since his friend's disappearance, their expanding root systems and accumulated leaf litter potentially concealing evidence that might have been visible immediately after his vanishing. They established temporary camp in the grove's shade, unsaddling horses and allowing them to rest while conducting initial reconnaissance of the immediate area. Thomas found himself moving slowly through terrain his friend had once described in detail, searching for anything that might explain Elias's final journey to this specific location. "Sheriff," Danny called from position near the creek's edge, "you might want to see this." Thomas joined the young man beside Clearpool, where water had carved depression in underlying rock, creating natural basin that reflected surrounding cottonwoods and sky with mirror-like clarity. Danny pointed to area where recent rainfall had softened earth enough to preserve impressions, though age made interpretation challenging. "Could be hoofprints," Danny suggested, indicating several depressions that showed partial definition despite weathering. "Hard to tell how old they are, but the pattern suggests single horse moving slowly through here, maybe stopping at water." Thomas knelt beside the potential tracks, applying decades of experience reading sign to their partial evidence. The depressions could indeed represent hoofprints, though natural erosion and accumulated debris made definitive identification impossible. More intriguing was their apparent age. While clearly not recent, they seemed less weathered than 15-year-old impressions should appear. "These look too fresh for Elias's original visit," Thomas observed, sharing Danny's puzzlement. "But too old for recent travelers either. It's like they're suspended somewhere between new and ancient." Danny nodded agreement with this assessment, recognizing similar contradiction and evidence that defied conventional explanation. "Maybe someone else has been coming here regularly," he suggested, maintaining some kind of connection to the place. The possibility intrigued Thomas, while raising additional questions about who might visit this remote location and why. Elias had spoken of the grove as having special significance, but Thomas had assumed this reflected personal sentiment rather than broader recognition of the site's importance. As afternoon progressed toward evening, they expanded their search beyond immediate vicinity of the cottonwood grove, investigating surrounding terrain for additional evidence of Elias's presence or clues about his final intentions. The work proved challenging due to time elapsed since his disappearance and natural processes that obscured physical evidence. Yet gradually they accumulated subtle indications that someone had indeed spent considerable time in this area. "Look at this," Danny called from an elevated position overlooking the grove. "Someone built shelter here at some point. Recent enough that materials haven't completely weathered away." Thomas climbed to Danny's vantage point, where scattered remains of temporary structure suggested extended occupation rather than brief camp. Positioning and construction indicated someone with frontier experience who had intended to remain for substantial period while maintaining concealment from casual observation. "Could be hunters or prospectors," Thomas suggested, though something about the shelter's placement seemed familiar, reminiscent of Elias's preference for positions that offered both protection and strategic visibility. "Maybe," Danny agreed, though his tone suggested doubt. "But why here specifically? There's better hunting in other areas, and I've never heard of mineral prospects in this drainage." The question reflected Thomas's own puzzlement as they examined evidence that suggested purposeful occupation without obvious practical motivation, unless the occupant had been drawn to this location by concerns that transcended conventional resource extraction or recreational activity. Evening shadows lengthened across the grove as they concluded their first day's investigation, results proving both frustrating and intriguing. While they had discovered suggestive evidence of human presence, nothing provided definitive answers about Elias's fate or clear direction for continuing their search. "We'll camp here tonight," Thomas decided, recognizing advantage of establishing base camp in location that offered water, firewood, and strategic position for observing surrounding terrain. "Tomorrow we can expand the search to adjacent areas." As they prepared evening meal and settled horses for night, conversation naturally focused on their discoveries and theories about what might have happened to Elias Crow. Danny proved thoughtful companion, offering insights gained through extensive experience in similar terrain, while maintaining appropriate skepticism about extraordinary explanations for ordinary evidence. "You think he's still out here somewhere?" Danny asked as stars became visible overhead. "Not necessarily alive, but present in some way?" Thomas considered the question carefully, balancing rational assessment against intuitive impressions that had been building throughout the day. "I think some men leave stronger impressions on places they cared about," he replied finally. "Whether that constitutes presence or just memory, I'm not sure it matters, as much as honoring the connection." This philosophical response seemed to satisfy Danny, who nodded understanding while maintaining watch on horses that showed unusual alertness despite comfortable circumstances. Thunder's restlessness in Clearwater had prepared Thomas for the possibility that animals might sense things humans missed, but their mount's behavior suggested awareness of something beyond ordinary nocturnal wildlife. "They're nervous about something," Danny observed, noting how frequently the horses raised their heads to scan surrounding darkness. "Not panicked, just watchful." Thomas shared this assessment, recognizing behavior that indicated presence of something significant without necessarily threatening. Their horses showed alertness rather than fear, suggesting whatever commanded their attention might be familiar rather than dangerous. As midnight approached, both men maintained quiet vigilance while ostensibly preparing for sleep. Neither voiced explicit expectation of unusual occurrences, but their heightened awareness suggested shared anticipation of something beyond ordinary night sounds and settling horses. Then they heard it. Distant but unmistakable sound of single horse moving through terrain southwest of their position. Hoofbeats carried clearly in still air, maintaining steady rhythm that suggested deliberate progress rather than random movement. Yet something about the sound seemed subtly wrong, lacking the complex audio signature of shod hooves striking varied terrain that characterized normal mounted travel. "Someone's out there," Danny whispered, reaching instinctively for his rifle while maintaining prone position beside their banked fire. Thomas listened intently, applying decades of experience to audio analysis that might reveal information about the distant rider's identity and intention. The hoofbeats continued approaching their general area, though specific direction remained difficult to determine due to acoustic tricks common in broken terrain. "Single horse," Thomas confirmed quietly, moving slow and steady like someone familiar with the country who doesn't need to hurry. The sound grew gradually closer until they could distinguish individual hoofbeats with clarity that should have made visual contact possible despite darkness. Yet careful observation of surrounding landscape revealed nothing. No silhouette against stars, no sound of displaced vegetation, No additional indicators of approaching rider beyond auditory evidence that continued building until it seemed the horse should be directly visible. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the sound ceased completely. No gradual diminishment indicating departure, no final hoofbeat echoing into silence, simply immediate absence, where, moments before, clear evidence of approaching horsemen had commanded their attention. Both men remained motionless for several minutes, straining to detect any indication of continued presence. Their own horses had fallen completely silent, no longer showing nervousness but rather profound stillness that suggested recognition or acceptance of whatever had been moving through surrounding darkness. "Did you see anything?" Danny finally whispered, his voice tight with controlled excitement. "Nothing," Thomas replied honestly, though the absence of visual confirmation didn't diminish impact of their shared auditory experience. But something was definitely out there. They maintained alert watch through remaining hours of darkness, but the mysterious hoofbeats did not return. Only as dawn approached did their horses resume normal behavior, beginning to graze and move naturally around their temporary camp beside Willow Creek. Morning light revealed no tracks or other physical evidence of nocturnal visitor, despite conditions that should have preserved clear impressions in soft earth near water source. Thomas and Danny conducted careful search of approaches to their camp, finding nothing that might explain the sounds they had both heard with unmistakable clarity. "Like the hoofprints we found yesterday," Danny observed, referring to tracks that seemed neither fresh nor ancient. Present but not quite real, if that makes sense. Thomas understood exactly what the young man meant, recognizing pattern that challenged conventional understanding while remaining consistent within its own mysterious logic. Whatever forces connected Elias Crow to this mesa seemed to operate according to rules that intersected with physical reality without fully participating in its limitations. "Let's expand the search today," Thomas decided, determined to pursue investigation despite its increasingly extraordinary dimensions. If Elias came here for a specific purpose, there might be other locations that held similar significance for him. They broke camp efficiently, securing their equipment while preparing for broader exploration of mesa terrain that might contain additional clues about Elias's final ride. Danny's knowledge of local geography proved invaluable as they planned systematic investigation of areas that might have attracted the missing horseman's attention. "There's old Anasazi ruins about 3 miles north," Danny suggested, referring to ancient cliff dwellings that occasionally drew curious visitors despite their remote location. "And there's supposed to be Spanish treasure caves somewhere in eastern ridges, though I've never found it myself." Both possibilities offered legitimate destinations that might have motivated Elias's final expedition, though Tomas suspected his friend's interests had been more personal than archaeological or mercenary. The missing horseman had spoken of finding something lost rather than discovering something hidden, suggesting resolution of existing connection rather than establishment of new relationship with mesa terrain. They spent morning traveling systematically through elevated country, investigating locations that offered strategic vantage points or natural features that might have attracted Elias's attention. The work proved physically demanding due to challenging terrain and intense heat, but gradually they developed more comprehensive understanding of mesa geography and its potential significance to missing horsemen. At an elevated overlook that provided sweeping view of surrounding country, Thomas found himself studying landscape with appreciation for its austere beauty and recognition of qualities that would appeal to someone of Elias's temperament. The mesa offered solitude, challenge, and connection to something larger than individual concerns, exactly the environment where his friend had always seemed most comfortable. He loved country like this, Thomas observed, speaking as much to himself as to Danny. Places where a man could think clearly without distraction, where the land itself seemed to have something important to say. Danny nodded understanding, having observed similar response to wilderness among hunters and others who spent extended time away from towns and their complications. Some folks need space to be themselves, he agreed. Maybe that's what he was looking for, a place where he could finish something that needed finishing. The insight resonated with Thomas's growing understanding of Elias's final journey as resolution rather than exploration, conclusion rather than beginning. Whatever had drawn his friend to the mesa 15 years earlier had been building toward completion that required solitude and appropriate setting for personal significance rather than external witness. Afternoon brought them to elevated valley that showed signs of regular occupation despite its remote location. Evidence suggested someone had visited repeatedly over extended period, creating semi-permanent camp that offered strategic advantages while remaining concealed from casual observation. "This is more than hunting camp," Danny observed, examining constructed windbreak and food storage that indicated extended residence. "Someone's been using this place regularly for considerable time." Thomas studied arrangements that demonstrated both frontier experience and personal preference for a particular combination of shelter, visibility, and access to resources. Something about site selection and construction seemed familiar, reminiscent of Elias's methodical approach to establishing temporary camps during extended expeditions. "Could be him," Thomas said quietly, allowing possibility to exist without demanding immediate confirmation. If he survived his disappearance somehow and chose to remain on the mesa rather than return to town, the theory offered explanation for various mysterious elements they had encountered: the maintained but ambiguous tracks, the nocturnal hoofbeats, the apparent ongoing occupation of remote locations. Perhaps Elias had not vanished, but rather withdrawn, continuing existence in wilderness that had always suited him better than civilization. "But why?" Danny asked, voicing question that challenged this interpretation. What would make a man choose to disappear from his regular life without explanation? Thomas considered various possibilities, drawing on his knowledge of Elias's character and circumstances during period preceding his final ride. The horseman had never married, maintained few close relationships, and seemed most content when engaged in activities that took him away from towns and their social complications. Perhaps his disappearance represented choice rather than tragedy, deliberate transition to life that better matched his essential nature. Yet this explanation didn't account for his failure to communicate with friends like Thomas, who would have understood and respected such decision. Elias had possessed too much integrity to abandon obligations without explanation, particularly promises made to people who trusted him. As evening approached, they established second night's camp in the elevated valley, positioning themselves to observe surrounding terrain while maintaining concealment from potential observation. Their horses again showed unusual alertness as darkness gathered, but their behavior suggested familiarity rather than concern, as if recognizing environment they had experienced before. "They know this place," Thomas observed, noting how readily their mounts settled despite being in unfamiliar location. "Not just the general area, but this specific valley." Danny agreed with this assessment, recognizing animal behavior that indicated previous exposure to particular environment. "Like they've been here before, or maybe multiple times." The possibility raised intriguing questions about their horses' histories and potential connection to ongoing mystery. If Elias continued residing somewhere on the mesa, he might have encountered their mounts during previous visits to town, or while observing clear water from distance. Animals possessed longer memories than humans often credited them with, particularly regarding places and people that had made strong impressions. As stars emerged overhead with desert brilliance, Conversation gradually shifted from investigation details to broader contemplation of mysteries that had brought them to this remote valley. Both men found themselves drawn into philosophical consideration of questions that transcended simple missing person case. What if he chose to stay out here? Danny asked, voicing theory they had discussed earlier. What if his final ride wasn't intended as return trip, but as permanent departure? Thomas weighed this possibility against his knowledge of Elias's character and their friendship's depth. He would have found a way to let me know, he concluded with certainty. Maybe not immediately, but eventually. We had understanding about such things. Neither of us would disappear without giving the other chance to understand why. This conviction reflected Thomas's confidence in bonds that had developed through shared dangers and mutual respect built over years of partnership in challenging circumstances. Whatever had happened to Elias, deliberate abandonment of their friendship without explanation seemed inconsistent with personal integrity that had defined the missing horseman's character. Near midnight, they again heard distant hoofbeats, approaching through surrounding terrain. This time the sound carried additional detail: soft creaking of leather, occasional metallic clink of equipment, sounds that suggested rider and horse moving together with practiced familiarity through darkness that posed no obstacle to their progress. Both men remained motionless beside their carefully maintained fire, listening as hoofbeats approached until they seemed to pass directly through their camp without pause. Yet visual observation revealed nothing, despite acoustic clarity that should have made identification inevitable. "He's checking on us," Danny whispered after sounds faded beyond detection. "Making sure we're safe, but not ready to make contact yet." Thomas found this interpretation both comforting and frustrating, suggesting Elias might indeed survive while remaining unwilling to resolve mystery that had haunted Clearwater for 15 years. If his friend chose continued concealment despite awareness of Thomas's presence, reasons must exist that transcended simple preference for solitude. Tomorrow we'll try a different approach, Thomas decided, formulating a plan that acknowledged extraordinary nature of their situation while maintaining focus on investigation goals. Instead of searching for physical evidence, we'll make ourselves available for contact if he's ready to communicate. This strategy represented significant shift from conventional search methods toward recognition that they might be dealing with circumstances that required unconventional response. If Elias remained aware of their presence while choosing not to reveal himself directly, perhaps patience and receptivity would prove more effective than aggressive pursuit. Their third day began with establishment of observation posts at elevated location that offered comprehensive view of surrounding mesa terrain while providing comfortable base for extended vigilance. Rather than continuing systematic search, they positioned themselves as accessible presence that might encourage communication from someone who had maintained concealment for 15 years. The strategy proved wise as morning progressed into afternoon without conventional discoveries, but with increasing sense that they were being observed by someone who remained carefully hidden. Their horses showed consistent awareness of presence beyond visual confirmation, while subtle signs suggested movement in surrounding terrain that matched their own positioning for optimal mutual observation. "He's watching us," Danny confirmed what both suspected, staying close enough to monitor our activities but far enough to maintain concealment, like he's trying to decide whether to make contact. Thomas shared this assessment, recognizing behavior that suggested internal conflict between desire for communication and concerns that prevented direct approach. If Elias indeed survived while maintaining voluntary exile, his reasons for avoiding contact must be compelling enough to override natural inclination toward friendship with someone who had come searching for him. Late afternoon brought subtle change in atmospheric pressure that both men noticed, despite absence of visible weather indicators. Their horses became increasingly alert, standing motionless while focusing attention on approaches to their observation post. Then they saw him, distant silhouette, moving slowly along elevated ridge, perhaps half a mile from their position. Single rider, on horse that moved with distinctive gait Thomas recognized despite years of separation and considerable distance. Even at range that made specific identification impossible, something about horse and rider combination struck a familiar chord that resonated with memories of shared expeditions across similar terrain. "That's him," Thomas said quietly, statement rather than question, certainty based on recognition that transcended visual confirmation. Danny raised his hand in greeting gesture, but the distant rider made no response beyond continuing slow progress along ridgeline until geographical features concealed him from view. Yet his appearance had been deliberate, calculated to provide confirmation without commitment to direct contact. "He knows we're here," Danny observed. "He's letting us see him, but keeping distance. Maybe testing whether we'll respect his privacy or try to force confrontation." Thomas understood immediately, recognizing behavior consistent with Elias's character and approach to relationships that required mutual consent rather than obligation. His friend was offering opportunity for acknowledgement without demanding immediate resolution of questions that had brought them to the mesa. "We'll wait," Thomas decided, demonstrating respect for Elias's apparent preferences. If he wants to communicate further, he'll find appropriate way to do so. Our job is to be available without being intrusive. This patient approach reflected understanding developed through years of friendship with someone who valued autonomy above social conventions. Elias had always resisted any form of coercion, responding better to invitation than demand, to understanding than expectation. As evening approached, they maintained their observation post while preparing for what might prove final night of their expedition. Thomas found himself contemplating questions that went beyond simple location of missing friend, to broader issues of respect for choices that others made about their own lives, even when those choices created concern or confusion for people who cared about them. Perhaps Elias's continued concealment reflected not rejection of friendship, but protection of something that required solitude to maintain. If his survival on the mesa depended on conditions that contact with town life would disrupt, forcing reunion might constitute harm rather than rescue. Darkness brought return of familiar hoofbeats, but this time the sounds approached directly rather than circling their position. Thomas and Danny remained beside their fire, making themselves clearly visible while avoiding any gesture that might suggest threat or demand for interaction. The hoofbeats stopped perhaps 50 yards from their camp, close enough for conversation but distant enough to permit rapid departure if circumstances required. For several minutes, silence stretched between visible presence and hidden observer, each waiting for other to establish terms of potential communication. "Elias," Thomas called finally, his voice carrying clearly in still air without suggesting urgency or demand. "I kept the promise as best I could, but I never found your body to take to the Cottonwood Grove. If you're ready to help me understand what happened, I'm ready to listen." Silence continued for long moments, then familiar voice emerged from darkness beyond their fire's illumination. "Thomas, I wondered if you'd eventually come looking." The words carried weight of recognition mixed with resignation, as if Elias had been expecting this encounter while hoping it might be avoided. His tone suggested neither joy nor anger at their reunion, but rather a complex acceptance of situation that had become unavoidable. "Are you well?" Thomas asked, focusing on immediate concern rather than demanding explanations that might terminate fragile communication. "Well enough," Elias replied, his voice carrying subtle changes that 15 years of isolation might produce in any man. Different than I was, but adapted to circumstances, Danny remained silent, recognizing this initial exchange as renewal of relationship that predated his involvement and required careful handling to maintain. His role was witness rather than participant, unless specifically invited to contribute. "Why didn't you come back?" Thomas asked the question that had haunted him for 15 years. "We searched for you, mourned you, assumed you were dead." "Because I am dead," Elias answered quietly. "At least, the man who rode out of Clearwater 15 years ago is dead. What remains is something different, connected to this place in ways that make return impossible." This response introduced possibilities Thomas had not considered, despite their increasingly extraordinary experiences on the mesa. If Elias spoke literally rather than metaphorically, their reunion involved encounter with something beyond conventional categories of life and death. "I don't understand," Thomas admitted, inviting explanation without demanding it. "The mesa changed me," Elias continued, his voice carrying conviction about experiences that clearly defied easy description. "I came here looking for something I'd lost years earlier, a connection to land and purpose that town life had weakened. I found it, but accepting it required leaving behind everything that tied me to ordinary existence." The explanation suggested transformation rather than disappearance, evolution rather than tragedy. If Elias had indeed undergone fundamental change that made return to previous life impossible, his concealment reflected practical necessity rather than personal choice. "The Cottonwood Grove," Thomas said, remembering their final conversation. "You asked me to take you there if something happened." "Yes," Elias confirmed, "but what happened wasn't death in usual sense. It was rebirth into different kind of existence that belongs to this place rather than human community. The grove remains important, but not as burial site." Thomas struggled to process implications of these revelations while maintaining focus on practical concerns that had motivated their expedition. If Elias survived in some transformed state, questions about honoring his final request required reinterpretation rather than abandonment. "What do you need from me?" Thomas asked directly, recognizing that conventional friendship might require unconventional expression under extraordinary circumstances. Silence stretched again before Elias responded, as if carefully considering what could be requested without creating obligation that neither could fulfill appropriately. "Understanding," he said finally. "Acceptance that some changes go too deep for reversal, and that choosing different existence doesn't constitute rejection of previous relationships, but recognition of evolution beyond their original context." This request resonated with Thomas's growing awareness that their expedition might conclude with acknowledgement rather than reunion, acceptance rather than rescue. If Elias had indeed found peace through transformation that required continued separation from ordinary life, friendship might best be expressed through respect for his choices rather than attempts to restore previous arrangements. "Will I see you again?" Thomas asked, allowing possibility of farewell without demanding promises about future contact. "Perhaps," Elias replied, his tone suggesting uncertainty about circumstances that might permit additional encounters. "The Mesa draws people who are ready for its gifts, though not everyone recognizes or accepts them. Your willingness to search for answers suggests openness that could lead to deeper understanding." The conversation continued through remaining hours of darkness, touching on memories they shared while exploring implications of Elias's transformation for their continued relationship. By dawn, Thomas had achieved something approaching peace, with mysteries that might never yield complete explanation, but could be honored through appropriate respect for their essential nature. As morning light began revealing surrounding landscape, the presence that had maintained communication throughout night gradually withdrew, leaving Thomas and Danny alone beside their dying fire, with memories of extraordinary encounter that challenged everything they thought they understood about life, death, and the country that connected them. "What do we tell people in town?" Danny asked as they prepared for a return journey to Clearwater. Thomas considered this question carefully, recognizing responsibility to protect Elias's privacy while providing some resolution for community that had wondered about his fate for 15 years. "We tell them we found evidence that he's at peace," Thomas replied finally. "This final ride accomplished what he intended, and that his memory deserves respect, rather than continued speculation about circumstances beyond our complete understanding." This approach would satisfy most residents, while preserving mystery that had become part of Clearwater's folklore. Those who required more definitive answers would remain unsatisfied, but protecting Elias's transformed existence took precedence over community curiosity about matters that touched realms beyond ordinary experience. Their return journey proceeded without unusual incidents, though both men found themselves changed by encounters that had expanded their understanding of possibilities that frontier life might contain. Thomas felt particular satisfaction in achieving resolution that honored his promise to Elias while respecting transformation that made literal fulfillment impossible. Upon reaching Clearwater, Thomas submitted his final report as territorial sheriff, documenting expedition results in terms that provided appropriate closure while preserving essential mysteries. His replacement would inherit routine responsibilities without burden of unresolved questions about predecessors' failure to honor promises made to vanished friends. Jake Morrison listened to their account with understanding that reflected his own experiences with phenomena that defied conventional explanation. Thunder's behavior confirmed their story. The aging stallion had remained calm throughout their absence, as if finally satisfied that his master's fate had been properly acknowledged. "He found what he was looking for," Jake observed, recognizing peace in animal that had carried uncertainty for 15 years. "Sometimes that's all any of us can ask for, chance to find our proper place and make peace with whatever that requires." Thomas nodded agreement with this philosophical perspective, grateful for community that could accept extraordinary explanations when ordinary ones proved insufficient. Clearwater's residents would create their own understanding of Elias Crow's final ride, transforming investigation results into folklore that honored both mystery and resolution in ways that served community needs while protecting individual privacy. Years later, as Thomas settled into retirement activities that took him frequently into country surrounding his former jurisdiction, he occasionally glimpsed distant rider moving slowly across elevated terrain with purposeful grace that reminded him of friend who had found different solution to questions about belonging and purpose that challenged all men who lived between wilderness and civilization. These sightings brought comfort rather than concern, suggesting Elias continued pursuing whatever transformation had claimed him, while maintaining connection to landscape they both loved. The mesa had granted his friend peace through change that might seem tragic to some, but represented fulfillment for someone whose essential nature had always been better suited to solitude than society. The last ride of Elias Crow had indeed ended, but what began in its place continued across terrain that welcomed those ready to accept its gifts, whatever form those offerings might take, and whatever sacrifices they might require, from men courageous enough to embrace transformation that led beyond conventional understanding toward mysteries that rewarded faith with their own form of eternal presence. The wedding celebration at Samuel Garrett's ranch had concluded with such profound joy that Thomas McKenna found himself reluctant to depart immediately. He spent 3 additional days as guest of the grateful family, sharing meals and conversation while his music continued to weave threads of connection between the assembled relatives who had traveled from distant homesteads to witness Mary's marriage to Jacob Miller. During quiet moments between social obligations, Thomas practiced his violin in the barn loft, where Belle rested contentedly in clean straw and abundant feed. The Phantom Waltz had become an integral part of his repertoire, though he played it now with understanding that transcended personal healing. The Eternal Dancers had taught him that love's reality persisted across all boundaries, temporal, physical, and spiritual, manifesting wherever hearts remained open to receive its gifts. On his final evening at the ranch, Samuel approached with offer that demonstrated the impact Thomas's music had made during the celebration. "Several families have been talking," the rancher explained, settling onto a wooden crate beside Tomas's makeshift practice area. "Word's spread about your playing, and there's folks who'd pay good money for a musician willing to travel circuit between settlements." Tomas considered the proposition carefully, recognizing opportunity for stable income while serving communities that rarely experienced professional entertainment. Yet something about the suggestion felt incomplete, as if his recent transformation required expression through different form of service than conventional performance schedule might provide. "I'm honored by their interest," he replied thoughtfully, "but I feel called towards something less predictable. The music that found me in that prairie clearing seems to require freedom to manifest where it's most needed, rather than where it's most expected." Samuel nodded understanding, having observed during the wedding celebration that Thomas's most powerful musical moments emerged spontaneously rather than through planned performance. "Then follow that calling, friend. The frontier's big enough for both settled musicians and wandering ones." The next morning brought farewells that carried weight beyond ordinary business conclusion. Mary and Jacob expressed gratitude that extended far beyond hired entertainment, recognizing that Thomas's presence had transformed their wedding into something approaching sacred celebration. Even children who had danced to his melodies gathered to wave goodbye, their young faces bright with memory of music that had made ordinary evening feel magical. As Thomas guided Belle onto the trail leading southwest from the Garrett Ranch, he carried with him more than payment for services rendered. The wedding had confirmed his understanding that personal healing could become foundation for service to others. That transformation of individual grief into acceptance of love's eternal nature prepared him to help others recognize similar realities within their own circumstances. The terrain gradually changed as he traveled, rolling grassland giving way to more rugged country, where mesas and buttes interrupted the horizon with dramatic geological formations. Red sandstone cliffs rose from valley floors like ancient sentinels, their stratified faces telling stories of geological epochs that dwarfed human concerns, while inspiring awe at time's vast dimensions. It was in this transformed landscape that Thomas first heard mention of Elias Crow, though the name meant nothing to him initially. A trading post where he stopped to purchase supplies and allow Belle to rest. Conversations among other travelers frequently returned to tales of legendary outlaw whose exploits had become frontier folklore throughout the southwestern territories. "Never seen anything like it," remarked grizzled prospector whose clothes bore dust of countless trails. "Crow could outride any man alive, shoot straight as arrow flight, and disappear into country so rough that posses gave up tracking him after few days of broken horses and empty water barrels." The trading post owner, weathered woman of indeterminate age, whose sharp eyes missed nothing, added her own perspective to these admiring accounts. "Elias Crow wasn't just another outlaw. she observed while tallying Thomas's purchases. Man had code about him, never harmed innocent folks, only took from those who could afford losses, and helped more than few families through hard times when banks wouldn't show mercy. Thomas listened to these stories with interest that went beyond casual curiosity. Something about the descriptions of Elias Crow resonated with themes that had emerged during his own recent transformation. The possibility that individuals could transcend ordinary limitations when motivated by purposes larger than personal gain. The way certain figures seemed to embody archetypal qualities that spoke to deeper human aspirations. Is he still active in these parts? Thomas asked, though recent stories suggested the legendary outlaw's career might be approaching its natural conclusion. The prospector and trading post owner exchanged meaningful glances before the older woman responded carefully. Some say Elias Crow rides these canyons still, though others claim he's been dead for years and what folks see now is just ghost, unwilling to accept that his time has passed. This tantalizing ambiguity intrigued Thomas, reminding him of his own encounters with phenomena that existed at boundaries between conventional reality and mysteries that exceeded ordinary understanding. Perhaps Elias Crow represented another manifestation of forces that operated according to principles beyond typical human experience. Legends that achieved reality through persistent belief and recurring manifestation. As Thomas prepared to continue his journey deeper into canyon country, the trading post owner approached with additional information delivered in confidential tone. "If you're traveling the old mining roads through Devil's Canyon," she said quietly, "keep watch for rider on Black Horse who appears at sunset. Some claim it's Crow himself, still patrolling territories he once controlled. Others say it's Death riding to collect what's owed." "Which do you believe?" Thomas asked, genuinely curious about her assessment. The woman smiled enigmatically, her expression suggesting knowledge acquired through years of frontier experience. "I believe some stories become true through telling, and some riders become legends through refusing to accept ordinary endings to extraordinary lives." With this cryptic wisdom echoing in his thoughts, Thomas mounted Bell and headed toward canyon country, where red rock formations created landscape both beautiful and forbidding. The tales of Elias Crow had planted seeds of anticipation in his awareness, preparing him for potential encounter with mysteries that might parallel his recent experiences with phantom dancers and eternal music. The evening sun cast long shadows across the endless prairie as Thomas McKenna guided his weathered horse along the narrow trail that wound through the tall grass like a thread through golden silk. At 34, Thomas carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had learned to find solace in solitude, his violin case secured carefully behind his saddle, alongside modest provisions that sustained him during his wandering journeys across the frontier territories. Music had been Thomas's companion long before circumstances had set him adrift in these vast spaces. Born to Irish immigrants in Saint-Denis, he had shown natural talent for the fiddle from an early age, learning traditional melodies from his father while developing his own distinctive style through years of practice and performance. His reputation as a skilled musician had once provided comfortable living in the city's theaters and dance halls, where couples whirled to his melodies beneath chandeliers that cast rainbow patterns across polished floors. That life seemed distant now, transformed by grief into memory as fragile as morning mist. 6 months earlier, consumption had claimed Margaret, his wife of 8 years, leaving Thomas with nothing but an empty house filled with silence where her laughter had once echoed. Unable to bear the weight of familiar surroundings that spoke constantly of loss, he had sold their belongings, saddled his horse, and set out into the territories with only his violin and the hope that distance might eventually diminish the ache that settled like winter in his chest. "Easy, Belle," he murmured to his mare as she picked her way carefully through a patch of uneven ground. The horse, a gentle chestnut with intelligent eyes, had proven an ideal companion for his nomadic existence. Patient with his irregular schedule, content to graze while he practiced his music, alert to dangers that his distracted mind might overlook. The trail he followed showed little evidence of regular use, more of a game path worn by deer and other prairie creatures than a proper road intended for human travel. Yet something about its direction appealed to Thomas's sense of destination, leading him away from the established routes that connected towns and settlements toward regions where solitude came naturally and music could flow without constraint of time or audience expectation. As afternoon deepened toward evening, the landscape gradually changed from open grassland to areas where scattered groves of oak and cottonwood provided welcome relief from the constant exposure of treeless prairie. The air grew cooler with approaching dusk, carrying scents of wild flowers and sage that reminded Thomas of childhood summers, when the world had seemed full of endless possibility rather than profound absence. His attention was drawn to smoke, rising in a thin, straight column ahead, not the heavy, dark smoke of a prairie fire, but the pale, controlled smoke of a well-tended campfire. Thomas approached cautiously, knowing frontier etiquette demanded respectful identification before intruding upon another traveler's temporary claim to camping space. "Hello, the camp," he called out when close enough to make himself heard without shouting. "Thomas McKenna, traveling musician, requesting permission to water my horse at your stream." The response came from an elderly woman who emerged from beside a modest wagon positioned near a grove of cottonwoods. She appeared to be in her 70s with silver hair pinned neatly beneath a faded sunbonnet and wearing practical traveling clothes that spoke of years spent adapting to frontier conditions. Despite her age, she moved with steady confidence as she approached Thomas with evident curiosity rather than suspicion. "Musician, you say?" she called back, her voice carrying the slight accent that suggested European origins. "Been long since I heard proper music in these parts. I'm Clara Hoffman, bound for my sister's place near Strawberry. You're welcome to share my fire if you've got tunes to trade for supper." Thomas dismounted gratefully, leading Belle toward the small stream that meandered through the grove. "That's generous of you, Mrs. Hoffman. I'd be honored to play for such hospitable company." As he unsaddled his horse and allowed her to drink, Thomas studied his surroundings with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to read landscapes for both beauty and practical considerations. The grove provided excellent shelter from prairie winds, while the stream offered reliable water source. More intriguingly, he noticed evidence of previous use: fire-blackened stones arranged in careful circles, wagon ruts that suggested regular stopping place for travelers, and something else that caught his attention with unusual intensity. Perhaps 100 yards beyond Clara's wagon, the tree line opened into a clearing where tall prairie grass grew in perfect circle around what appeared to be remnants of much older campsite. Even from this distance, Thomas could distinguish weathered stones arranged in deliberate patterns, fragments of what might once have been wagon wheels, and the unmistakable depression where generations of fires had left their mark upon the earth. "Curious place for camping," he observed, gesturing toward the distant clearing as he joined Clara beside her fire. The elderly woman followed his gaze, her expression shifting subtly from casual friendliness to something more thoughtful, perhaps even reverential. "Ah, you've noticed the old place," she said quietly, settling onto a camp stool with slow care. "Been there longer than anyone remembers. My grandmother used to tell stories about what happened in that clearing. though most folks nowadays think it's just prairie nonsense. Thomas arranged his bedroll at respectful distance from Clara's wagon, while his curiosity sharpened around her cryptic comment. Throughout his travels, he had encountered numerous frontier legends. Tales of buried treasure, ghostly apparitions, mysterious lights that appeared on certain nights. Most proved to be embellished accounts of ordinary phenomena, though a few had contained elements that resisted easy explanation. "What sort of stories?" he asked, retrieving his violin case with careful attention to its security straps and protective padding. Clara busied herself with preparing evening meal, adding vegetables to a pot that already contained what smelled like rabbit stew. "Wedding that never finished," she replied matter-of-factly, as if discussing weather patterns or crop conditions. Back in the early days of settlement, when this area was even more isolated than it is now. Young couple from different families, planning to marry right here in this grove where their parents had first met years before. Thomas opened his violin case, revealing the instrument that had been his grandfather's gift for his 16th birthday. The wood glowed warm amber in the firelight, its surface bearing small scars and worn patches that testified to decades of faithful service. As he tuned the strings with practiced efficiency, he found himself drawn into Clara's narrative, despite usual skepticism regarding frontier folklore. "Everything was prepared," Clara continued, stirring the stew with wooden spoon worn smooth by years of use. Families had traveled from homesteads scattered across 3 counties. Musicians brought fiddles and harmonicas. Someone had constructed a dance floor from wagon boards, and the bride wore her grandmother's dress that had crossed the ocean from Germany. The violin's strings responded to Thomas's adjustments with pure, clear notes that seemed to harmonize naturally with the evening sounds of insects beginning their nightly chorus. Yet something about those notes struck him as unusual tonight. Not in the instrument's response, which remained familiar and reliable, but in how the sound seemed to carry differently in this particular location, as if the very air possessed qualities that enhanced musical resonance. "What happened to prevent the wedding?" he asked, though part of him already anticipated the general outline of tragedy that such stories typically contained. Clara ladled stew into tin bowls, handing one to Thomas, along with a piece of bread that smelled of home kitchens and careful preparation. Cholera outbreak struck the nearest settlement 3 days before the ceremony. Word came by messenger that the epidemic was spreading. Families needed to return immediately to care for their own. The wedding party dispersed in single afternoon, promising to reschedule when the danger passed. Thomas tasted the stew, finding it excellently seasoned and warming against the evening chill that had begun to settle as darkness approached. But they never had the chance to return. The epidemic claimed both families within 2 weeks, Clara confirmed quietly. Bride, groom, parents, siblings. Cholera showed no mercy to hopes or plans. The clearing where they had prepared for celebration became reminder of loss instead of joy, though my grandmother always insisted something of their happiness remained there, waiting. This conclusion struck Thomas as particularly poignant, given his own recent experience with loss that had transformed familiar places into landscapes of absence rather than comfort. Yet Clara's telling suggested different perspective, not loss as erasure, but as transformation into something that persisted beyond ordinary understanding. "Your grandmother believed in ghosts?" he asked carefully, neither endorsing nor dismissing such possibilities. Clara smiled, her weathered features softening with memory. She believed in love strong enough to outlast the circumstances that originally contained it. DK used to say she sometimes heard music drifting from that clearing on certain evenings. Fiddle tunes and the soft sound of feet moving in waltz time, across ground where no dancers were visible. As if summoned by her words, a faint sound caught Thomas's attention. So subtle he initially dismissed it as wind moving through the cottonwood leaves or distant cattle lowing in some remote pasture. But as he listened more carefully, the sound resolved into something unmistakably musical. Slow, melodic notes that seemed to drift from the direction of the distant clearing with ethereal quality that made his pulse quicken with recognition. "Do you hear that?" he asked quietly, setting down his bowl and reaching instinctively for his violin. Clara tilted her head, listening with the concentrated attention of someone accustomed to distinguishing subtle sounds across prairie distances. After several moments, her expression brightened with what appeared to be pleased recognition rather than alarm. "The waltz," she whispered. "First time in years I've heard it so clearly." The music continued, growing neither louder nor fainter, but maintaining constant presence at the edge of audibility, notes that seemed to weave themselves into the natural evening sounds until distinguishing between melody and ambient noise became impossible, and found himself unconsciously humming along with the tune, his fingers moving against imaginary strings as if his hands remembered music he had never consciously learned. "I should investigate," he said, standing and cradling his violin with practiced care. As a musician, I mean. Professional curiosity about where such clear notes might originate in apparently empty clearing. Clara nodded, understanding, though her expression carried gentle warning alongside encouragement. "Go carefully, Thomas McKenna. What waits in that clearing means no harm, but it represents something precious that deserves respectful approach. My grandmother always said the music appeared for those who needed healing, not entertainment." This perspective resonated with Thomas's current emotional state more deeply than he cared to examine. The grief that had driven him from Saint-Denis remained as constant companion, softened by travel and solitude, but never fully absent from his awareness. If Clara's grandmother had been correct about the music's purpose, perhaps tonight offered opportunity for encounter with forces that understood loss, while pointing toward possibilities beyond mere endurance. Taking his violin and bow, Thomas walked slowly toward the distant clearing, guided by music that seemed to beckon without demanding, invite without compelling. The tall grass whispered around his legs as he moved, creating rhythm that complemented the mysterious melody in ways that felt intentional rather than coincidental. As he approached the edge of the circular clearing, Thomas could see more clearly the remnants Clara had described. Weathered stones arranged in patterns that might once have supported temporary structures, fragments of wagon wheels half buried in prairie soil, and at the center, a depression lined with blackened stones where countless fires had burned across the decades since the interrupted wedding. The music grew more distinct without becoming louder, as if he were approaching its source through layers of time rather than simple physical distance. Thomas could now identify individual instruments within the ethereal ensemble. Fiddle taking the lead melody, harmonica providing gentle accompaniment, and underneath it all, the soft rhythm of feet moving in traditional waltz pattern across ground that showed no visible dancers. Standing at the clearing's edge, Thomas raised his violin and bow, waiting for the melody to complete its current phrase, before joining the invisible ensemble with trembling hands and racing heart. When his bow touched the strings, the notes that emerged seemed to blend seamlessly with the phantom music, as if his instrument had been specifically tuned to harmonize with sounds that existed beyond ordinary acoustic principles. The experience proved unlike anything in Thomas's extensive musical background. Rather than leading or following the melody, he found himself participating in musical conversation that required no communication beyond the notes themselves. His violin sang in harmony with instruments he could not see, played by musicians who cast no shadows in the moonlight that had begun to illuminate the clearing with silver radiance. As the waltz continued, Thomas became aware of movement within the clearing. Not solid figures exactly, but suggestions of presence that appeared in peripheral vision before dissolving when observed directly. A flash of pale fabric that might have been a wedding dress, the momentary outline of a man's formal coat, glimpses of faces that smiled with joy, undimmed by tragedy that had claimed their earthly existence. The dancers, if dancers they were, moved with fluid grace that spoke of love unencumbered by physical limitations. Thomas watched, transfixed, as two figures became visible in the clearing center. Bride and groom locked in eternal waltz, spinning slowly around the ancient fire pit, while their feet traced patterns that seemed to ignite the very ground with remembrance of happiness too pure to be destroyed by death itself. Thomas played with tears streaming down his face, though whether from grief or overwhelming beauty he could not determine. The music seemed to reach directly into his chest where sorrow had made its home, not to remove the pain, but to transform it into something that could coexist with joy, to demonstrate that love's reality transcended the circumstances that had originally given it form. The bride turned toward him as she danced, her face radiant with happiness that acknowledged loss without being diminished by it. In her expression, Thomas glimpsed truth that his grief had obscured. Margaret's love had not vanished with her death, but had transformed into something that existed beyond temporal limitations, available to him whenever he opened his heart to receive rather than merely remember. For timeless moments, Thomas played while ghostly lovers danced their eternal waltz beneath stars that had witnessed their original joy and continued to bless their persistent celebration. The music filled the clearing with presence that transcended ordinary understanding, not supernatural in the sense of violation of natural law, but hypernatural in its demonstration of realities that existed alongside conventional experience, without contradicting it. Gradually, the phantom ensemble began to fade, instruments dropping out one by one, until only Thomas's violin continued the melody. The dancers slowed their eternal spinning, coming to rest beside the ancient fire pit, where they gazed at each other with love that required no words, no promises, no assurance beyond what their hearts contained. As the last notes of the waltz faded into prairie silence, the figures dissolved like morning mist, leaving Thomas alone in the clearing, with the profound understanding that solitude and presence could coexist in ways his previous experience had never suggested. Thomas lowered his violin slowly, overwhelmed by the encounter's emotional intensity, while simultaneously feeling lighter than he had in months. The grief remained, but it no longer filled the entire space of his awareness. Room had been created for other feelings: gratitude for love received, appreciation for beauty that persisted despite tragedy, hope that connection transcended physical separation. Walking back toward Clara's campfire, Thomas found the elderly woman waiting, with patient attention and knowing expression that suggested she had anticipated something significant might occur during his musical investigation. She poured coffee from the pot that had been keeping warm beside the coals, handing him a cup with steady hands that showed no surprise at his emotional state. "The waltz found you," she observed gently, settling back onto her camp stool with satisfaction of someone whose expectations had been fulfilled. Thomas nodded, accepting the coffee gratefully, as he tried to find words for experience that seemed to exceed language's capacity for adequate description. "I've never encountered anything like that," he finally managed. Music that seemed to exist independently of any visible source. Dancers who appeared more real than reality itself. Clara smiled with understanding. that came from years of carrying her grandmother's stories, and perhaps her own encounters with mysteries that frontier life occasionally revealed to receptive observers. My grandmother always said the clearing preserved their wedding night exactly as it should have been, not as memory of what was lost, but as celebration of what could never be taken away. This interpretation offered framework for processing what Thomas had witnessed, suggesting that phenomena like the phantom waltz represented not supernatural intrusion into natural order, but revelation of natural order's greater complexity than ordinary perception typically acknowledged. Love, music, joy, these forces might possess reality independent of the physical circumstances that had originally given them expression. Will they appear again? Thomas asked, though part of him recognized that demanding repetition of such experiences might diminish their essential mystery. When needed, Clara replied simply. When someone arrives who requires healing rather than entertainment, reminder rather than distraction, the music chooses its audience, as much as the audience discovers the music. Thomas spent the remainder of the evening in contemplative silence, occasionally playing soft melodies on his violin, while Clara prepared for sleep with the efficient routine of experienced traveler. The notes he produced seemed to carry differently than usual, enriched by his encounter with the Phantom Ensemble in ways that would influence his music for years to come. As he arranged his bedroll beneath stars that seemed closer and more personally attentive than usual, Thomas reflected on the evening's events with amazement at how quickly profound transformation could occur when least expected. This morning he had awakened as man defined primarily by loss. Tonight he rested as someone who had rediscovered presence within absence, connection within solitude. The clearing remained visible in the moonlight, peaceful and ordinary in appearance, yet forever transformed in Thomas's perception into sacred space, where love had demonstrated its capacity to transcend temporal limitations. Tomorrow he would continue his journey across the territories, but with understanding that carried promise of eventual return to life's fullness rather than mere endurance of its diminishments. Sleep came easily for the first time in months, accompanied by dreams of dancing figures whose joy had proved stronger than the circumstances that had challenged it. In those dreams, Margaret appeared not as memory of loss, but as presence of love that required no physical form to remain perfectly real and infinitely available. Morning arrived with characteristic prairie brilliance, golden sunlight streaming across grass that sparkled with dew crystals like scattered diamonds. Thomas woke, refreshed in ways that went beyond simple rest, feeling as if fundamental tensions that had governed his existence for months had finally begun to release their hold on his spirit. Clara had already begun preparing breakfast, moving about her camp with quiet efficiency while Belle grazed contentedly nearby. The elderly woman's expression suggested she had slept well, perhaps comforted by knowledge that the clearing's gift had found appropriate recipient in Thomas's grief-opened heart. "Will you continue west today?" she asked, offering him coffee and biscuits that smelled of home kitchens and careful preparation. Thomas considered the question while gazing toward the clearing that appeared perfectly ordinary in daylight, yet remained forever changed in his perception. "Eventually," he replied, "but perhaps I'll linger in this area for a few days, practice my music, let Belle rest, think about what I witnessed last night." Clara nodded approval of this decision. The clearing rewards those who approach with patience rather than demand immediate revelation. My grandmother used to say the music revealed different aspects to listeners who returned multiple times, each encounter deepening understanding of what love could accomplish when freed from ordinary limitation. After breakfast, Thomas helped Clara break camp and load her wagon, ensuring she had everything needed for safe continuation of her journey to Strawberry. As she prepared to depart, the elderly woman reached into her wagon and withdrew a small package wrapped in faded cloth. "My grandmother's music box," she explained, placing it carefully in Thomas's hands. "Plays the same waltz you heard last night, though never so beautifully as when the clearing itself provides the music. She would want it to stay with someone who understands its significance." Thomas accepted the gift with profound gratitude, understanding that Clara was entrusting him with tangible connection to the phantom dancers and their eternal celebration. The music box felt warm in his hands, its modest weight carrying significance far beyond its physical property. "Thank you," he said simply, knowing that no elaborate expression could adequately convey his appreciation for both the gift and the evening that had made him worthy to receive it. Clara smiled, climbing onto her wagon seat with careful attention to her aged joints. "The clearing will be here when you're ready to visit again," she said as she took up the reins. "And the music will find you wherever you go, now that you've learned to listen for it." As her wagon disappeared beyond the cottonwood grove, Thomas found himself alone with Belle and the profound silence that followed significant encounters. Yet the silence felt different now, not empty but full of potential, not absence but space prepared for new possibilities to emerge. He spent the morning exploring the area more thoroughly, discovering game trails that led to vantage points offering spectacular views of the surrounding prairie. From elevated positions, he could see for miles in every direction, rolling grassland that stretched to distant horizons, where earth met sky in shimmering lines that seemed to dance in heat waves rising from sun-warmed soil. The clearing remained visible from these heights, appearing as a perfect circle of slightly different grass coloration that would be invisible to casual observers, but now stood out clearly to Thomas's educated eye. Even in daylight, something about the space seemed to hold residual energy from the previous night's encounter, not visible exactly, but perceptible to awareness that had been opened to subtler dimensions of reality. That afternoon, Thomas returned to the clearing with his violin, positioning himself at its edge while he practiced scales and exercises that helped maintain his technical skills. The notes seemed to resonate differently in this location, carrying further and clearer than they should according to acoustic principles he understood. More significantly, Belle showed unusual interest in his playing, positioning herself where she could observe both Thomas and the clearing while maintaining alert attention that suggested she perceived elements beyond her master's awareness. As evening approached, Thomas prepared simple meal from his provisions, while keeping careful attention to atmospheric changes that might indicate return of the phantom ensemble. The transition from day to night proceeded with magnificent display of colors that painted the western sky in shades of gold, orange, and deep purple that gradually gave way to star-filled darkness. When the first faint notes drifted from the clearing's center, Thomas felt no surprise, only deep gratitude for second opportunity to participate in musical conversation that transcended ordinary experience. Tonight, the ensemble seemed larger, including instruments he hadn't noticed previously, guitar providing gentle rhythm, harmonica adding ethereal harmony, and what sounded like distant voices, humming wordless melody that wove through the instrumental parts like silver thread through tapestry. Thomas joined the phantom musicians with confidence born of previous night's experience, his violin finding its place within the ensemble as naturally as if he had rehearsed with them for years. The waltz unfolded with variations and elaborations that demonstrated the music's living quality, not mere repetition of fixed composition, but ongoing creation that responded to each performer's contribution while maintaining essential character that connected it to the interrupted wedding celebration. The dancers appeared more clearly tonight, Perhaps because Tomas's eyes had learned to perceive their reality during previous encounter. Bride and groom moved with fluid grace that spoke of love purified by tragedy, into essence undimmed by temporal limitations. Around them, other figures became visible, wedding guests whose joy had transcended the epidemic that claimed their earthly existence, musicians whose dedication to celebration proved stronger than death itself. Thomas played with tears of gratitude rather than grief, overwhelmed by privilege of participating in a demonstration of love's capacity to create realities that existed beyond physical constraints. The music seemed to reach directly into his heart where Margaret's memory resided, not to resurrect what had been lost, but to reveal what had been transformed. Love that required no physical presence to remain perfectly real and infinitely available. For hours, the celestial celebration continued, with Thomas's violin weaving melodies that expressed his own love for Margaret while harmonizing with eternal joy of the phantom wedding party. The music created space where past and present, loss and presence, grief and gratitude could coexist without contradiction, where healing occurred not through forgetting, but through expanded understanding of love's true nature. As dawn approached, the phantom ensemble gradually faded, instruments dropping out one by one until only Thomas's violin carried the melody into approaching daylight. The dancers slowed their eternal waltz, coming to rest beside the ancient fire pit where they exchanged looks of infinite tenderness before dissolving into morning mist that rose from dew-covered grass. Thomas remained in the clearing as sunlight began to illuminate the prairie, overwhelmed by profound transformation that had occurred within his understanding of loss, love, and the possibilities available to human hearts willing to remain open despite grief's natural tendency toward closure. In the days that followed, Thomas established temporary camp near the grove, spending mornings exploring the surrounding territory, while afternoons were devoted to practice and composition, inspired by his encounters with the phantom waltz. His music evolved, incorporating elements that seemed to bridge temporal boundaries, melodies that spoke simultaneously of loss and presence, endings and beginnings, separation and eternal connection. Each evening brought return of the celestial ensemble, though Thomas learned that approaching with expectation rather than openness could prevent the music from manifesting. The phantom dancers appeared when his heart was prepared to receive their gift, rather than demand their performance. A subtle distinction that taught him important lessons about the difference between healing and entertainment. Belle proved excellent companion for this period of musical and spiritual exploration, content to graze in meadows near the grove, while remaining alert to her master's emotional state. The horse seemed to understand significance of their location, showing none of the restlessness that typically accompanied extended stays in single place during their travels. After a week of this healing routine, Thomas began to sense completion approaching. Not end of transformation, but achievement of stable foundation for whatever journey would follow. The grief that had driven him from Saint-Denis had been transmuted into acceptance that included, rather than excluded, love's continuing presence. Margaret existed now not as memory of loss, but as eternal companion whose love transcended physical separation. On what he sensed would be his final evening in the clearing, Thomas played with particular intensity, pouring gratitude for healing received and love rediscovered into melodies that seemed to lift directly from his heart into night air filled with stars and possibilities. The phantom ensemble responded with music of extraordinary beauty, creating symphony that expressed perfect balance between joy and sorrow, presence and absence, time and eternity. The dancers whirled with radiant happiness, their eternal wedding celebration reaching crescendo that seemed to bless not only their own interrupted joy, but all love that persisted despite circumstances that challenged its expression. In their faces, Thomas glimpsed truth that would sustain him through whatever trials lay ahead. Love's reality transcended the conditions that had originally given it form, remaining forever available to hearts prepared to receive its gifts. As the celestial waltz reached its conclusion, the bride approached Thomas's position at the clearing's edge, her ethereal presence somehow more solid and immediate than during previous encounters. She extended her hand toward him, not invitation to join the phantom dance, but gesture of gratitude for music that had enriched their eternal celebration. Thomas bowed respectfully, understanding that he had been granted privilege beyond ordinary experience, opportunity to participate in demonstration of love's ultimate triumph over separation, loss, and death itself. The bride smiled with radiance that seemed to illuminate the entire clearing before fading into morning mist that announced approaching dawn. Standing alone in the sacred space where love had proved its eternal nature, Thomas felt profound peace settle into regions of his heart where grief had maintained residence for months. The sorrow remained, but it no longer defined the totality of his emotional landscape. Room had been created for gratitude, hope, and renewed connection with life's fundamental goodness. When full daylight arrived, Thomas packed his belongings with deliberate care, knowing his time in this healing place had reached natural conclusion. Belle seemed to sense their imminent departure, showing increased alertness while remaining calm, trusting her master's judgment about timing and direction for their continued journey. Before leaving, Thomas took Clara's music box from his saddlebags and wound its mechanism carefully. A familiar waltz melody emerged in delicate notes that seemed to bless his departure, while promising connection that would persist regardless of physical distance from the clearing where love had demonstrated its eternal nature. As he rode away through morning sunshine that painted the prairie in shades of gold and green, Thomas carried with him more than memory of extraordinary encounter. The phantom waltz had become part of his musical vocabulary, his emotional repertoire, his spiritual understanding. Margaret's love traveled with him not as burden of loss, but as gift of presence that would enrich whatever music he created during the years ahead. The clearing diminished in the distance, but not in significance, remaining forever visible in Thomas's transformed awareness as sacred space, where healing occurred through recognition of love's capacity to transcend every limitation, except human willingness to receive its gifts. The campfire waltz would continue its eternal celebration, available to other wounded hearts that arrived prepared to participate in music that bridged temporal boundaries while demonstrating love's ultimate victory over separation itself. Miles ahead lay territories yet unexplored, communities that might welcome traveling musician whose repertoire now included melodies learned from phantom ensemble in haunted clearing. Thomas urged Belle forward with renewed sense of purpose, carrying healing music toward audiences who might need reminders that love's reality transcended every circumstance that challenged its expression, that somewhere in the vast prairie, dancers still whirled to eternal waltz that celebrated joy, too pure to be destroyed by tragedy, love too strong to be diminished by death, and music too beautiful to be silenced by time itself. The journey continued across rolling grassland that stretched endlessly toward horizons where earth met sky in wavering lines of heat and promise. Thomas found himself humming fragments of the phantom waltz as Belle maintained steady pace through terrain that seemed somehow more welcoming than during his earlier travels. The music had changed him in ways that extended beyond emotional healing. His very perception of the landscape appeared enhanced, more attentive to subtle beauties that previously might have escaped notice. Wildflowers dotted the prairie in clusters of purple, yellow, and white that created natural gardens among the sea of grass. Thomas began stopping more frequently to appreciate these displays, understanding now that beauty persisted even in spaces touched by loss, that celebration could coexist with sorrow without diminishing either experience. His violin emerged often during these pauses, adding human music to the symphony of wind and bird song that provided constant accompaniment to his travels. 3 days after leaving the sacred clearing, Thomas encountered another traveler heading east, a middle-aged rancher named Samuel Garrett, who recognized the quality of Thomas's instrument and asked about his musical background. Their conversation around shed campfire revealed that Samuel's daughter was to be married the following month, and the family had been searching for a musician capable of providing appropriate entertainment for the celebration. "We've got families coming from 5 different counties," Samuel explained, stirring beans that bubbled over carefully tended flame. "Some folks haven't seen each other in years, and my Mary deserves wedding music that'll give everyone reason to dance until dawn. You interested in earning honest wages while bringing joy to good people?" Thomas considered the offer carefully, remembering Clara's words about the phantom waltz appearing for those who needed healing rather than entertainment. Yet something about Samuel's description resonated with lessons learned in the haunted clearing. The importance of celebrating love while opportunity existed. The value of music that brought people together rather than simply providing background accompaniment. "I'd be honored to play for your daughter's wedding," Thomas replied, meaning the acceptance more deeply than ordinary business arrangement might warrant. Music deserves to serve joy whenever possible. Samuel's weathered features brightened with relief and satisfaction. "Mary will be pleased. She's been worried we wouldn't find proper musicians willing to travel so far for frontier wedding. Most prefer staying in towns where work comes regular." As they finalized arrangements for the upcoming celebration, Thomas found himself sharing carefully selected details about his recent experiences in the prairie clearing. Not the supernatural elements that might strain credibility, but the profound understanding about love's persistence and music's healing power that had emerged from those encounters. Samuel listened with attention that suggested personal recognition of loss transformed through acceptance. "Lost my wife 2 years back," the rancher admitted quietly, gazing into flames that danced with hypnotic patterns. "Cancer took her slow, gave us time to say everything needed saying. But the silence afterward..." He shook his head, unable to complete the thought. Thomas nodded understanding, remembering his own recent experience with silence that had seemed to expand until it threatened to consume everything meaningful in his existence. "The clearing taught me that silence and presence aren't opposites," he offered gently. "Sometimes what we think is absence is actually love, speaking in language we haven't learned to hear yet." This observation seemed to resonate with Samuel, who sat quietly for several minutes before sharing memories of his deceased wife. Her laughter that had filled their home, her skill with garden plants that still bloomed in carefully tended beds, her insistence that their daughter receive education equal to any available in larger communities. As he spoke, Thomas heard echoes of his own grief transformed through acceptance into celebration of love received rather than mourning for connection lost. The following weeks passed in pleasant routine as Thomas traveled slowly towards Samuel's ranch, stopping frequently to practice music that might enhance the upcoming wedding celebration. His repertoire expanded beyond the Phantom Waltz to include traditional dance tunes, romantic ballads, and lively pieces designed to encourage participation rather than passive listening. Yet underneath all his preparations ran constant awareness of the eternal dancers whose joy had taught him music's true purpose. Belle thrived during this period of unhurried travel, her coat gleaming with health while her temperament remained alert and cooperative. The mayor seemed to understand significance of their mission, showing particular enthusiasm when Thomas practiced wedding music during evening camps. Sometimes she would move closer to his position, ears pricked forward, as if listening not just to melodies, but to intentions behind them. 2 days before reaching Samuel's ranch, Thomas encountered unexpected reminder of his recent transformation. Camping beside small stream that provided excellent water for Belle and pleasant surroundings for evening practice, he became aware of atmospheric changes that recalled his experiences in the haunted clearing. The air seemed to thicken with presence beyond ordinary perception, carrying subtle sounds that might have been wind through grass or distant echo of familiar waltz melody. Standing with violin ready, Thomas waited patiently as phantom music gradually became audible. Not the full ensemble he had encountered previously, but single fiddle, playing the eternal waltz with pure clarity that seemed to bless his upcoming performance at Samuel's daughter's wedding. The melody continued for perhaps 10 minutes before fading into prairie silence, leaving Thomas with profound sense of encouragement and connection. "They're still with me," he whispered to Belle, who had remained unusually attentive throughout the phantom performance. "The music travels wherever it's needed." This realization brought deep comfort, confirming that healing received in the sacred clearing would continue influencing his life, regardless of physical distance from that transformative location. The phantom dancers had given him more than temporary respite from grief. They had demonstrated love's capacity to transcend limitations while remaining perfectly available to hearts prepared to receive its gifts. Samuel's ranch proved to be a well-maintained operation, covering several thousand acres of prime grazing land. The main house, built from local stone and timber, projected air of prosperity achieved through honest work rather than inherited wealth. Outbuildings included barns, corrals, and guest quarters that would accommodate visiting families during the wedding celebration. Mary Garrett emerged from the house as Thomas approached, her resemblance to Samuel evident in strong features and direct manner that spoke of frontier upbringing, combined with gentle refinement. At 22, she possessed natural beauty enhanced by obvious happiness regarding her upcoming marriage to Jacob Miller, whose family ranch bordered Samuel's property to the north. "Mr. McKenna," she called out warmly, hurrying forward to greet their hired musician. "Father says you're the finest fiddle player in 3 territories. I can't wait to hear you play." Thomas dismounted carefully, retrieving his violin case before responding to Mary's enthusiasm, with a smile that reflected his own transformed relationship with music's purpose. "I'll do my best to provide melodies worthy of such a joyous occasion," he promised, meaning the commitment more deeply than ordinary professional courtesy might suggest. The next 2 days passed in busy preparation as families arrived from distant ranches and scattered homesteads. Thomas established himself in a comfortable room above the main barn, a position that offered privacy for practice, while remaining accessible to consultations about musical selections for various parts of the celebration. His reputation had preceded him, and several guests approached with requests for specific songs that held personal significance. Each consultation revealed stories of love found, tested and sustained through frontier challenges that might have defeated less determined couples. Thomas listened carefully to these accounts, understanding now that his role extended beyond simple entertainment to participation in celebration of love's triumph over circumstances that constantly threatened its expression. The phantom dancers had prepared him for this deeper understanding of music's sacred function. The evening before the wedding, Thomas joined family gathering around large bonfire constructed in clearing behind the main house. 3 generations of Garretts and Millers shared stories, songs, and traditional foods, while stars emerged overhead in magnificent display that rivaled any he had witnessed during solitary travels. His violin added gentle accompaniment to conversations that wove family histories into tapestry of connection spanning decades. As the evening progressed, Thomas found himself playing fragments of the Phantom Waltz, though he kept these passages subtle enough to blend seamlessly with more conventional selections. Yet, several listeners commented on the unusual beauty of certain melodies they couldn't quite identify, and he noticed couples drawing closer together during these ethereal interludes. Mary approached as the gathering began to disperse, her expression combining excitement about tomorrow's ceremony with gentle concern about details beyond her control. "Everything will be perfect, won't it?" she asked, seeking reassurance that Thomas understood encompassed far more than musical considerations. "Love makes its own perfection," he replied, offering wisdom gained through recent encounters with eternal celebration that had transcended every limitation except human capacity to perceive its reality. Music simply helps people recognize what already exists. This response seemed to satisfy Mary, who smiled with relief before joining Jacob for a quiet walk around the ranch grounds. Thomas watched them disappear into moonlight, their silhouettes merging into single form that recalled phantom dancers whose eternal waltz had demonstrated love's capacity to create realities beyond temporal constraints. The wedding day dawned with crystal clarity that promised ideal conditions for outdoor celebration. Thomas rose early to tune his violin and review musical selections that would accompany ceremony and subsequent dance. His preparations included private performance of the Phantom Waltz, played softly in the barn loft where only Belle could hear. Prayer of gratitude for healing received and blessing requested for joy about to be celebrated. As guests assembled for the ceremony, Thomas positioned himself where violin music could enhance rather than dominate proceedings. The simple beauty of prairie weddings struck him as perfectly appropriate. Wildflowers gathered by children decorated temporary altar constructed from ranch timber, while families arranged themselves in semicircle that included everyone in shared witness to love, declared publicly. When Mary appeared in her grandmother's white dress, walking arm in arm with Samuel toward Jacob, who waited with obvious adoration, Thomas began playing melody that seemed to emerge from his heart rather than memory. The notes that flowed from his violin created an atmosphere of sacred celebration that transformed ordinary ranch clearing into space worthy of eternal commitment being proclaimed. Throughout the ceremony, Tomas's music provided gentle accompaniment to vows that promised fidelity through whatever challenges frontier life might present. His melodies wove between spoken words and shared silence, creating soundtrack for love declared with such sincerity that several guests wiped away tears of recognition and blessing. As Jacob kissed his new bride and the gathering erupted in cheers and applause, Thomas played triumphant melody that seemed to lift everyone's spirits toward celebration that would continue well into the night. The Phantom Waltz had taught him that joy deserved full expression whenever opportunity presented itself, that love proclaimed deserved music worthy of its eternal significance. The dance that followed proved everything Samuel had hoped when hiring traveling musician whose reputation preceded him across the territories. Thomas played with inspired energy that encouraged participation from guests ranging from elderly grandparents to children barely old enough to walk. His repertoire included traditional favorites, alongside innovative pieces that seemed perfectly suited to each moment's particular requirements. Yet it was during the final dance of the evening that Thomas experienced most profound connection between his recent transformation and present celebration. As Mary and Jacob moved together in slow waltz that concluded their wedding festivities, Thomas played the phantom melody with such beauty that dancing couples throughout the clearing seemed to float rather than merely step across grass worn smooth by generations of celebration. In the firelight that illuminated happy faces and graceful movements, Thomas glimpsed eternal quality that connected this temporal celebration with the phantom dancers whose love had transcended death itself. All love partook of the same essential reality, eternal joy that manifested in temporary forms while remaining forever available to hearts prepared to receive its gifts. As the evening concluded and guests began preparing for departure or retirement to temporary accommodations, several people approached Thomas with gratitude that extended far beyond appreciation for a professional entertainment. His music had touched something deeper than ordinary pleasure, creating space where love could be experienced as sacred force rather than mere personal emotion. "Never heard fiddle playing like that," one elderly rancher observed, shaking Thomas's hand with firm grip that spoke of genuine recognition. "Made me remember why I married my Sarah 40 years ago and why I still feel like dancing when she smiles at me." Such comments confirmed Thomas's understanding that healing received in the phantom clearing had prepared him for ministry through music, service that helped others recognize love's eternal reality within their own temporary circumstances. The phantom dancers had given him more than personal comfort. They had trained him to participate in love's ongoing celebration wherever it manifested. And so, partner, as our tale rides off into the sunset, it's time for you to rest your weary bones beneath the endless prairie sky. Let the sounds of the west be your lullaby tonight, from the gentle crackle of the campfire to the soft prairie winds and the distant song of nightbirds, all flowing uninterrupted, with no advertisements to break the peace of your slumber. Sweet dreams, cowpoke, and may your trail lead to peaceful pastures tonight.